So, it's 1972, Richard Nixon is just finishing up his first term, and the US is emerging from a turbulent era. The Vietnam War was still going, however, the American troops were being declined under Richard Nixon. The distrust in the government, however, still existed, as the Vietnam War didn't become any more popular than it was. Inflation was rising, which brought a new level of economic uncertainty. The Nixon administration brought new diplomacy with the Soviet Union and with China. And despite all of the unpopular things about Richard Nixon, he still had a good approval rating of 60%. So the Republican Party was pretty united in keeping Richard Nixon as the candidate for 1972. This is not to say that he didn't have any opposition within the primaries, because he very much so did. Pete McCloskey, a congressman from California, was mainly running in protest of the Vietnam War, was a very strong anti-war Republican. And John Ashbrook, who was a congressman from Ohio, who ran because Nixon wasn't conservative enough. However, neither of them were able to defeat Richard Nixon. So Nixon and his trusty vice president Spiro Agnew were at it again. The Democrats, however, were a bit more divided. George McGovern, a senator from South Dakota, was known for his anti-war policies and progressive social programs. There was also Hubert Humphrey, former vice president, who was more of an establishment Democrat and was known for being pretty big on civil rights, but not as radical as McGovern was. There was also the comeback of everyone's favorite raging Call of Duty player, George Wallace. You know, the governor of Alabama who ran as the segregation candidate last election. So the party nominates McGovern because of how extremely liberal he is, and he picks his running mate to be Thomas Eagleton, a senator from Missouri. People saw it as a pretty solid pick until it started being reported that he was hospitalized for depression. So the worry of his mental health was worrying a whole lot of voters, and eventually Eagleton withdraws himself from the ticket. McGovern replaces him with Sergeant Shriver, a former ambassador to France and brother-in-law to former President John F. Kennedy. Now, Nixon's plan was actually not much different than it was last election. He planned to continue the Vietnamization that he's been doing, which was the gradual withdrawal of troops from Vietnam to let South Vietnam defend itself. He didn't want South Vietnam to just immediately get wiped out, which is why he opposed gradual withdrawal and not immediate withdrawal. Tough on crime, strong federal authority, you know, all that same stuff. He was focused on economic stability and fighting inflation. He was already quite popular because of his wage and prices controls, which froze businesses for about 90 days so that none of them could raise their prices. This lowered inflation and made a whole lot more people very grateful to Nixon. Now, McGovern wanted to just immediately withdraw all of the troops from Vietnam, stop all of the bombing that we were doing, stop spending so much money on our military, and start spending it more on domestic programs. He really wanted to expand welfare programs and help the poor. And he really appealed to the younger generation, who really wanted to stop the war. Now, the day of the election came on November 2nd, 1972, and to say that the election results were lopsided would be an understatement. If we're talking the popular vote, Nixon won by 60.7%, and McGovern ended up with 37.5%. However, nothing was more lopsided than the Electoral College result. McGovern won one singular state, Massachusetts. Well, he also won D.C., but that's not a state. This won him 17 electoral votes, And considering Nixon won literally every other state, he ended up with 520 electoral votes, one of the biggest presidential landslides in history. This election just went to prove that Richard Nixon was one of the most popular presidents, and I'm sure that second term is going to continue that, and history will remember him as such. Yeah. So January 20th, 1973, Richard Nixon was sworn in yet again to serve a legendary second term.
Nixon now, more than ever we need Nixon.